I thought it would be a good idea, and it's been a couple of years since I've had one of these classes, to look at some of the major pests of the vegetable garden. I am Adam Watson. I'm one of our agriculture agents here in Washington County. And when I say pest, I mean both insects as well as diseases. If we want to really paint with a broad brush, we could even include rabbits and groundhogs and deer. I don't cover those tonight. The short answer for those is fencing and graduating sizes, depending which one we're talking about. But certainly they could even be a pest. But what we're talking about mainly tonight are insects and diseases. This isn't going to be 800 slides of me just saying, here's an insect and here is a product to use for it. As we get into this, I'm going to point you to some resources, and that's kind of one of my major thrusts. I want you to know these resources are there and available to you, and that they're ones that I actually put to use whenever I'm working with folks. So I think they're high quality. Just let me state up front, if I do mention brand names, suppliers, anything like that, neither myself nor the University of Tennessee are implying an endorsement. And so certainly those not mentioned but of similar or like products are just as usable. The other thing I'll mention, we probably will talk some about pesticides tonight briefly. Just remember, the pesticide label is the law. That must be followed. Nothing I say changes that. And so nothing I tell you is justification to do something that is not allowed by that label. So one of the resources that I hope you're familiar with is our garden insect control manual. It's you can control garden insects. I love that it's very positive in the affirmation, and I think it's true. And so what I like about this is it has a lot of general information in the front, but then as you start flipping through it, it basically has these tables in there, and it has the vegetable and then various specific insects that attack it. I would say 85% of garden calls I get about insects and vegetables, you will find that insect already listed with this vegetable. So it's not that unusual. This covers the majority of problems we see in our gardens. So this is a good one. So not only does it give you an insecticide and in most cases multiple options, it kind of gives you a little clue as to how much you might put per gallon of spray. In a lot of instances, a gallon of spray is still way over what we would need in the home garden, but at least gives you a reference point. There's always that little caveat. That's why we have an asterisk on that column. Double check on the label. Concentration rates and things like that will change. And you also notice that we don't have specific product names listed. So manufacturers change products. And so what was once one particular active ingredient or insecticide, they now sell under a different name or vice versa. And so what this list listing is actually the active ingredient that would be listed on the label. So it's more like its chemical identity. And so that allows you to shop no matter what company your source happens to carry. Because lots of these are, and the vast majority of these are generic products. They're not in any way encumbered by a single company. So you can find multiple companies offering these active ingredients. The next column that is listed there is minimal interval days between last application and harvest. This was a professional growers group. We talk about PHI or pre-harvest interval. Same thing if you're familiar with that language. It's just once I spray it, how many days do I have to wait before I can harvest? And for some, it's going to be even zero. And so that just clues you into that. Again, confirm on the label. The last column has some different remarks. And depending on the exact scenario, it could be talking about frequency of application, maybe a limitation on how many applications we can apply, or some particular reference information that's of use. So it's good material and very useful for the home garden. In a similar manner, our home disease control publication. It likewise has good general information, and then we skip to where we basically have a table. This is listing some of the most common diseases we will see in our garden. What I like about it is it does describe the major symptoms well. So, where Cercospora leaf spot on asparagus is described as having tan spots with purple margins, That's actually pretty specific. You're not going to see that with every single leaf spot, so to speak, on asparagus. So, and then you also see where we also have some products that are recommended for control as well as cultural practices. I'll mention briefly later, integrated pest management. We're not only talking about chemical controls, but it's everything else that goes along with it. So lots of times if we try to rely only on chemical controls, we don't have good outcomes. And so an integrated method where we use cultural, biological, physical, depending on the exact pest, helps us have a better outcome and avoids us from overusing chemical products. The last one I want to mention is a publication that basically kind of goes a little bit more in depth on pesticide products. A lot of homeowners, I don't think, come to gardening knowing a lot about pesticides. And so this publication kind of takes you a little bit deeper, provides a little more information. It does a very good job of having both conventional and organic products and signaling those out. You will find mentions for organic products in the prior two publications. They aren't necessarily identified or actually called out in the manuals themselves. So that may be one weakness, that they're not readily identified in there, even though they are included. Well, this one actually does pull them out. It uses green as a coloring for the boxes of products that are organic. I grabbed a sample out of it. What's good about this is it talks about the active ingredients. So when you see bifenthrin or carbaryl or azadirachtin, it's going to tell you some common products that has that as an active ingredient. It's going to talk about the pests that it is effective against, and then comments on use. And they do specifically identify when things are organic. And so this just kind of lets you have a better understanding, I think, of how some of these products work. And you can see on some of these, like bifenthrin or zeta-permethrin, very broad spectrum in the garden, cover a lot of our insect pests. And so you can kind of get a feel about if I was trying to buy one or maybe two products to have on hand, this might give you an idea of some of those that might be useful for you. And so again, a good research or reference material to look at. I mentioned it earlier, and I'm just going to go a little bit into integrated pest management. Basically, not only chemical controls are at our use, but also other control methods. And so a big component of integrated pest management is actually inspection or scouting of our plantings. Because when we can find problems, whether it's an insect pest or a disease pest early, we have better outcomes. So small infestations, small insects are easier to deal with. And so because of that, we want to be out there actively scouting. Other things we want to keep in mind with integrated pest management, and I think kind of overarching everything, healthy plants resist pests to greater or lesser degrees, depending exactly what we're talking about. But certainly having healthy plants, that means proper fertility, irrigation, not sticking a tomato into cold soil 3 weeks before we should. All those sorts of things are stressing plants and make it more challenging to have a healthy plant. So making sure we have those proper practices in place means we have a plant that's at its best at resisting a pest. The other thing is, it's not just chemical. So sometimes it's when we plant. So we may plant early or late, trying to avoid a pest population. A very big one, and the two I have highlighted here to me are the two most important practices: sanitation of crop debris. So at the end of the season, and when I say that, that could be, if we have a cool season garden out right now, like I've got some radishes and some lettuce, things like that out. As those wind down, as they start failing to produce, or in the case of lettuce, starts flowering, I'm going to pull those out. I'm going to physically remove them. So sanitation is literally cleaning up the garden. And we should be doing that all season long as a crop begins to peter out. The reason we do that is both insects and disease can overwinter in that crop debris. And so whenever we remove it, we can remove, things like insect pupae that are overwintering. We can remove various overwintering forms of diseases. They do it in different ways, spores, oospores, and other forms. and we can literally take that out of the garden. So if we can ever reduce the amount of potential insects or disease in the garden, I want to do it. I want to be careful if I know I have insects or disease issues to not put that in my home compost pile unless I'm very diligent about temperature management. If you're out there checking with a thermometer, making sure you're getting above 130 degrees, you're probably okay to put whatever you want to in there. Myself included, I don't, most gardeners don't monitor temperature of compost piles as well as we should. So I'm going to avoid putting things that might be problematic and cause carryover issues with pests in my compost pile. So think about trashing it, think about burning it possibly, because I don't want that compost pile to become now the source of a disease or the source of an insect the next season. The other thing I really like to highlight with home gardeners is resistant varieties. This is probably more so for diseases than insects, although there are some varieties that we know are more attractive to certain insects. So disease resistant doesn't mean it can't get sick, doesn't mean it won't die. It just means all things being equal, they will last longer, they will be less damaged by a particular disease. And so generally, these are more modern varieties that are specifically bred for this. You find some heirloom varieties that have some good disease resistance, but not every heirloom, but not every modern variety is great either. So we do have to kind of seek these out depending on what disease we're talking about. So if you know you're having certain problems or we have frequent diseases in our region, it makes sense to try to seek out varieties resistant to those. Another topic I like to mention when I can is the planting of things like flowers, either for beneficial insects or pollinators. Sometimes they're referred to as refuges. That's a good practice, but I think sometimes it's oversold whenever it's presented. What those plantings hopefully do is allow a balance, because whenever we use pest control products, particularly insecticides, we have a risk, depending on the product, of killing non-target species or beneficials. And so there's some practices we can do to limit that. There are products we can focus on and others to avoid. But at the end of the day, if we're using chemical control products, we're going to have some off-species kills of other insects, beneficial insects. So by having these other plantings that we are not actively spraying, we hopefully have a balance there and we have good insects there that will then come back into our plantings. The challenge is those insect plantings are also there for the less desirable insects. So an example I've used before, because I've seen this, the white butterflies fluttering around our spring gardens. Those are the mamas to the caterpillars that are going to be eating all our brassicas. So all your kale and cabbage and broccoli, all the hoes are of benefit are from those white butterflies that are flying from their larval or their caterpillars. And so those adults actually don't feed on our brassicas because our brassicas don't have flowers unless something's gone really wrong. So those adults will actually feed on your beneficial insect planting, those flowers that have nectar. And so, too often I see this strategy presented just a single facet of we plant flowers with our garden and it solves every problem. I don't think it does. And so I love you having flowers in your garden, having even perennial plants just as long-term insectary plantings, but that doesn't mean we won't have insect problems. And so just understand it's not quite the one-way street that sometimes I see it presented as. Still a great practice, and I'd love to encourage you to do it. One question that I think is valid to ask home gardeners: do I need to spray? And really, it's going to depend on what crop and by extension, what pest we're talking about. Because in some instances, what we're talking about is more aesthetic damage or some loss of production. In other pests, it may be a complete loss of production, to where if we don't control some things well, we might have zero. And so one question I always have for gardeners, if they are saying, well, I don't want to use any control products in the garden, Are you okay with ugly produce? Are you okay if there's bug bites? Are you okay if things are misshapen? As long as you are, or as long as you don't care to cut out the bad spots, then you can remove a lot of spraying from the chore list, because there's nothing that says you must spray. In my own home garden, I don't spray at all. Part of it is a time thing. The other thing is, by the time I buy products and mix them, I'm thinking, why am I doing this when I can pay a farmer to do this? So I basically plant, water, and fertilize. That's what I do. Now, the caveat is my produce looks like that's all I do. It's not the picture perfect. You're not going to come to my house and look for that catalog perfect tomato. There might be a little stink bug damage on it. I'm okay with that. I can eat around it. I can cut around it. It's not that important to me. For others, it is. And so understanding what your personal threshold is important. The other thing is, if I have a failure, if my cucumbers get bacterial wilt that is actually vectored or introduced by cucumber beetles, I can go to the store and buy cucumbers. And so to me, if I always have the option to replace at harvest, I can be a little more casual in my approach to, do I have to protect it? You may feel differently on any of that, and that's perfectly fine. And so the thing to remember is, we're creating a good garden environment. It's great for growing plants. That same environment we created is great for growing pests. And so we're always trying to balance the approach. And so don't think that, if we could create a garden that no pest would visit, no plants would grow there either. So we're always going to have some understanding that there's going to be some loss or some damage. There is no way to have a perfect garden where there is no pest problem ever whatsoever. It just doesn't exist. If we are going to use control agents such as pesticides, one thing that's critically important is to identify the pest. Because one, we want to be able to use the right rate of or right amount of pesticide. So there are actually sometimes high and low rates on labels, and depending on the exact pest, a low rate may be ineffective. And so we may want to use the high rate for a particular pest. On the other hand, a low rate may be very effective, so we can save money and use less product. We want to make sure that that labeled pesticide is labeled for the pest, the plant, and the site. And by site, I mean that, we may have a product that controls a certain pest, but it's labeled for use on lawns, not in a vegetable garden. So legally speaking, we couldn't use it, and we wouldn't want to. The other thing to be aware of with using pesticides correctly, always pay attention to personal protective equipment during mixing or even application. Most of the products available to us as homeowners are not that nasty or terrible of products, but I'm still going to wear gloves when I'm mixing it, especially, or even eye protection, because when we're mixing things, that is when they're at their most concentration, when they're at their strongest. And so there's going to be an issue with some sort of exposure. That's when it's going to happen. So whatever personal protective equipment might be suggested by a label, I'm going to follow that. And just common sense. If we spill something on us, wash it off. If we're spraying, don't wear shorts and flip-flops. We don't want contact with these products and ourselves. Even organic products. Organic products are not exempt from causing issues. An example I've used before is when I was in college and working on the farm. In the organic sector, they were actually spraying some weed control products that were essentially, I want to say it was like cinnamon oil or one of the other oil-derived products. There's a class of herbicides that basically are oil products, and they work to chemically burn, maybe in clove oil, to chemically burn the weed, the top of it. They're pretty effective at that. Well, the guy who was spraying it, he was wearing appropriate protective equipment, but somehow or other, he had some of the spray get into his eye. And so he ultimately had to go to the emergency room and got his eyes washed out. Nothing permanently damaged, but it certainly was less an enjoyable experience. And that was an organic product. So just because something is organic doesn't mean we shouldn't be respectful of it and pay attention if there are precautions, because these are products that can have issues if we aren't doing our part. In the perfect world, we'd see homeowners rotate the mode of action. And what I basically mean by that is you wouldn't always use the same product or closely related product for control, whether it's diseases or insects. In the commercial world, they make this very easy. They have codes that they put on the product, so it's readily identified what its mode of action is, so you can switch. They don't do that for homeowner products. So it's something to think about. But for instance, all the insecticide products that active ingredients end in THRIN are unsurprisingly related to each other. They're all synthetic pyrethroids. And so lots of times when I'm talking to people, I'm like, well, go to the store and look for a Thrin product that has, the vegetable garden and the pest you're wanting on it. That's because it could be zeta permethrin, bifenthrin, cyhalothrin, permethrin, and some others. And they're all related chemicals. And for the most part, they're fairly interchangeable for insect control. Not always, but for the most part, they are. So it would be great if we did sometimes mix in a malathion or a carbaryl or something like that occasionally, just so we don't have resistance happen on the insecticide side. Same thing on fungicides, which we have fewer of those available to us, and not all of them are great on all diseases. But if we can mix it up a little bit, that's not a bad thing. I want to encourage you to consider really how much of a product you're going to use over the length of the season. So generally speaking, a concentrate that we have to mix is cheaper per end unit of ounce of application. But one, it's more work to mix it. Two, if you mix up more than you actually need to apply, how are you going to store it? How you dispose of it at the end of the season. If you've got more left over that you can't use already mixed up, we can certainly retain pesticide products, especially concentrates, from one season to the next. Keep them out of temperature extremes, don't let them freeze, and generally they'll last for a couple of years at least. But ready to use products that we can either, and actually in the month of April, we had a hazardous product with a solid waste division here in Washington County. So there are events like that where you can dispose of these products readily, safely, and appropriately. One of the best ways, if you mix up more than you need, is just to actually apply it to a labeled site. So after you've applied it, just continue applying it in the vegetable garden until you are empty of your sprayer is one method to do. So sometimes really consider, don't mix up a gallon of product when a pint might be all you need for several weeks worth. And so especially in the home garden, that's a scenario. So those smaller containers that seem very expensive per ounce that are ready to use, sometimes that might be all we need for the entire season, and that might be an easier way to go about it. So I mentioned earlier about scouting is critically important for pest control. It limits the potential damage to a crop because we're getting there earlier. And the best thing is, whether we're talking about disease or insects, when things are first infesting that plant, first showing up, they're either younger or in fewer number, so it's easier to control. Especially when it comes to diseases, we don't have curative products. Our products are protectants. And so if we wait until we see large infestations of disease, we already have a lot of effects happening. And so I always think of products as being kind of like armor. They're in place before the arrow shows up, you're okay. But if they're not, you have problems. And it's kind of the same idea. We can't cure a leaf spot once it's on that leaf, but we can prevent it from infecting. This is one where if you use reading glasses, make sure you have them with you in the garden, because we're talking about little small things that if you have to have glasses for reading, you are going to have those with you in the garden to be effective as scouting. So scouting, it's not just a cursory walk by the garden. We've got to be flipping over leaves. We got to be looking in plant whorls. Why? Because insects love to hide because they are food for so many other things. So most insects are not up proud on top of the leaf where you can see them. They are hiding from you. There are some that whenever we start approaching and they see us, they will literally let themselves fall off the plant and hide in like mulch on the ground. So we have to be really paying attention. Don't just look for the adult insects, which we may be most familiar with, but also look for larval or eggs, and even the pupa, depending on the insect. And so nymphs for incomplete metamorphosis more or less look like the adult. They're a little bit different looking, but they at least look fairly similar. You can see the connection. Complete metamorphosis, where we have a larva, very often the larva looks nothing like the adult. And so it can be surprising what we actually have. When I'm looking for insect problems in the garden, I look for colors, textures, size discrepancies. I'll explain that in a minute, and shapes that I don't expect on a plant. So some of this is becoming familiar with what we grow. When we find an insect, is it a good guy? Is it a bad guy? Is it beneficial? I don't want to be killing ladybug larvae that are eating aphids because they look icky, and I might think it's a bad thing. We will come across pollinators. We will have predatory insects that eat other insects. And then we'll have some incidental pests that, yeah, they're bad guys, but they're not really a problem. So we're not necessarily going to pull out the control options just because we happen to see an insect on a plant. Is it really a key pest for the plant? So let's say we're growing green beans and we see lace-chewed leaves like this. If we start flipping over those leaves, we are probably likely going to see a little beetle like this. Similar in shape, because it is in the same family as a ladybug, but very different colorations, very coppery. The head is the same color as the body. It's not black. It doesn't have the white W or M markings on the head like we would see with the lady beetles, the multicolored Asian lady beetles, for instance, that they can be orangish, but not really copper. This picture doesn't necessarily do it justice for the copper color. We keep looking, and this actually happened when I was looking through these plants last year. I found this guy. I have forgotten exactly which one he is, but he's just a leaf hopper. And so while there are some leaf hoppers that can actually transmit some diseases, this one was not of concern. And particularly, remember, our damage were lacy leaves. Leaf hoppers are sap feeders. This guy is just there having lunch. He's not going to be a real problem to this plant, so I just ignore him. But what I do find is this little yellow spiky looking thing, which are really soft. And if you squish them, they'll stain your fingers yellow for a while. This is actually the larval stage of that beetle. So that beetle is actually the Mexican bean beetle. You can see the eggs in the upper right. They're kind of oval shaped, bright yellow. Not hard at all to see on those underside of leaves, but you have to be looking on the underside of a leaf. And there again, you see the larval stage, small but brightly colored. So again, they pop out on a leaf, and then the adult. And again, similar in shape to Asian multicolored lady beetles, but very different color. And again, no W or M marking on the head. Here again is some window painting or lacy defoliation. But I do want you to not automatically think, oh, if I have lacy defoliation on a green bean plant, then it must be Mexican bean beetle, because the picture there along the bottom, that is actually Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles will feed on green beans, especially in years where they're in high number. But one big difference is they're proud on top of the leaf. They're not worried about getting eaten by everything. And so they're not hiding. So again, this is where don't assume lacy leaves are either Mexican bean beetle or Japanese beetle. Look around and see what you can find. Japanese beetles don't hide well. They don't try to.
What eats a Japanese beetle?
Chickens and guineas will eat Japanese beetles. There are control products. Again, the Thren products would control these quite readily. So, I mean, Japanese beetles are a big pest pressure, but in and of themselves, we've got control options. So, again, not something you'll see every garden every year, but both of these are out there and they have similar damage patterns. This actually happened. We had purchased some plants for a garden that was going in at a site with kids, and I had them outside. I happened to look. I'm like, what in the world's the white stuff on this pepper leaf? Just so you know, peppers aren't supposed to have white stuff on them, on their leaves. Got to looking closer. Oh, those are the shed pupal skins of aphids. So the peppers we had bought had aphids on.
Already.
And that's not uncommon. When you think about where you find a lot of plants, it's outdoors. So aphids are readily available in the environment. So if they didn't come in on the shipment, they could have been on other plants. So they made it over to the pepper plants. Not a big deal. We got control options. These are small little plants. You could squish them. You can use insecticidal soap. But you get to looking, and on the right is actually one of the leaves up above that initial leaf I saw. And there you see the infestation of those on the underside. If you just looked from above and that white hadn't, though those exoskeletons hadn't landed on the leaf below, it would have been very hard to see. The plants themselves had no symptoms, although they had quite a few aphids going on. So don't wait for the symptom to be my plant is looking bad, because very often that means it's a very bad situation. So these looked fine, but they were heavily infested. So we got it under control and there was no issue. I mentioned earlier, and it may have seemed a little odd to you, I said, look for things that are out of proportion when you're in the garden. On the left, it is not a pepper plant. That's actually a milkweed plant. And so those are the bright orange aphids that are actually oleander aphids that will feed on milkweed species. You may have seen them if you grow milkweed. Ignore the color for a moment. If you're looking over that milkweed plant and you have stems that are covered in those and not covered in those, you will see dramatically different sizes. So a stem that is covered in aphids like that will be out of proportion. And again, some of this is making sure if you use reading glasses, you have them on, you're looking for details like that. Why is that twig thicker? You get to looking, oh, it's got insects all over it. And so it's little things like that that we can cue in on to find insects in the garden.
I was told that birds, one time they're carnivore, like they eat the bugs, another time they're herbivore and they eat the plants. Have you heard that?
So birds will eat insects whenever they can. I mean, obviously, when they have nestlings, they're hot and heavy, getting as much as they can. So I would say maybe their volume individually is up or down. But I don't think birds are like us. They can eat vegetative matter, but they're not like cows and where that's exclusively going to provide their food. So, even hummingbirds eat insects. And so we don't think of them doing that, but they do. They have to. Nectar is great, but it's not going to give you protein. And so I would say birds throughout the season are going to have some effect. Now, whether birds are going to eat the particular pest, that's another question. I don't know of any that really eat aphids. We'll leave that to the ladybugs and lacewing larvae.
I'm like,
yeah.
Oh,
And certainly, I mean, if you see birds in your garden, they could be finding something. Occasionally, birds will peck tomatoes or things like that. It's not as common, but it happens. It does happen. Or what if you've got tomatoes and you're going through the garden and suddenly you see a black speck on top of your tomato? Like, what in the world is that? Or maybe you see these little flower or star-shaped little bits on top of the ground or the walkway. It may be green, it could be black. Well, that is actually the fecal matter of our hornworm. And so this was actually taken in the Jonesboro, the Lincoln Park vegetable garden, if not last year, the year before. And that's how I found this, is I saw the black fecal matter on a green tomato. I said, uh-oh, because I knew what that was. And then I started looking on the plant, and lo and behold, I found him. I also found on that plant the hornworm on the right. The one on the right, the white cocoons are a very good sign. That's what killed this hornworm. And so it was pretty desiccated by the time I found this. But what is, there's parasitic wasp that will actually inject an egg inside of these caterpillars. And so while they're feeding and munching, those larvae are feeding on the caterpillar. And then these cocoons, you'll notice if you look closely at the picture, they're open on the end. So these wasps have actually grown up and left. And now they're out there attacking other hornworms and caterpillars. So, yes, you can control these with BT when they're little. When they're big like this, hand picking and squishing is effective. One unique thing about these is they will actually glow under UV light. So if you take a black light out to your pepper and tomato plants at night and you have these, you can find them that way.
Mm.
They're the larval stage of a pretty moth. It's not too flashy, but a moth, one of the hawk moths. So, but they can, because of their size, they can, especially if they get on small plants, they can absolutely hammer them. They can eat them down to just, it's a skeleton of stems left. So they can be rather aggressive. So, and again, depending on how big the plant is, at first you don't notice it because a few leaves, even stems here or there going bare may blend in, but look for that fecal matter calling card because that very likely is going to be the first thing that you see.
What is the wasp that lays their eggs on this one,
That may be the trichogama wasp, but don't hold me to that. I'm trying to pull that out of my memory. So there's a number of different wasp species that are parasitoids. There are actually some wasps that parasitize aphids even. And so some of these are tiny, tiny, tiny little wasps.
They look like a fly, some of them sometimes,
They could, yeah. I mean, and that's it.
but not.
But yeah, and so I mean, they're interesting. Depending on the exact pest, you can sometimes purchase those predators, but purchasing predators and placing them in the garden doesn't work real well because they're out in the open and they'll leave. Works pretty good in a greenhouse, not so much in a garden.
Or the birds will eat them.
Or the birds will eat them, or some of our, I'll mention this in a minute. Some of our good insects, they kill insects. They don't care if they're good or bad. And so you may have an insect that's eating one you would prefer to not eat, but it happens. So we also have things like imported cabbage worms. So there on the left is a pupa, blends in well on the plant. The caterpillar there is one that's not too old. I say that because that's on a very up close shot of a leaf, and those are little leaf hairs. So you can see how enlarged that is. When these are first hatched, they are just tiny, tiny. Of course, the egg is tiny. And there is one of the potential moths. That happens to be the southern cabbage worm. There's imported cabbage worm. There's diamondback moths, different ones, but essentially they all do the same thing. And so, with something like cabbage worms that are a true caterpillar, and even with hornworms, if you're looking for a lower impact insecticide, that's where something like BT or Bacillus thuringiensis can be used. There's both organic and non-organic formulations. The big difference is probably the surfactants in it. It's not the active ingredient, but it's actually a strain of bacteria that whenever we spray it on the plants, it has to be sprayed, for instance, on the underside of leaves where the caterpillars are. But when they ingest it, it actually creates a protein in their stomach and kills them. And so, spraying the moth, spraying even the caterpillar itself with it doesn't do it. They have to ingest it. So it has to be on that leaf surface. They have to eat it. Other BT products you may be familiar with are those that are used for like mosquito control. So those dunks that we use for like small feature ponds and things like that in the garden, that's another type of Bacillus thuringiensis that actually will attack the larval stage of mosquitoes. And there's actually now a new formulation on the market that is useful for Japanese beetle control. And I've seen studies out of Michigan or Minnesota where it was effective on adult beetles on plants, but it's expensive right now because one company holds the patent. So it's not available cheaply, but it is out there. I want to say the name is something like Beetle Gone or Beetle Off. If you search for it, you can find it. I would have to look at the label again. So that's a good question. I'd have to look at the label again to see if it would be applicable for vegetable use. But that is something that, lots of times people have been wanting a lower impact insecticide for the ornamental world for Japanese beetle. And it appears this is it, although it maybe comes at a high price tag currently. So harlequin beetles, another common pest we see in brassicas. They aren't hard to find. They're pretty brightly colored. The eggs are kind of different looking because they look like little black and white striped barrels before they hatch. And so they're kind of neat looking. When you see just a few of these early in the season, you might be able to hand pick. If I see a few of the adults, I'm going to start looking real hard for eggs flipping over leaves. But especially when these build up in numbers, they can cause a lot of damage. So harlequin bug, brightly colored, not hard to find, but they are good at sliding around to the other side of a leaf when you're trying to turn the leaves over and things like that. So this is one that I think insecticides can definitely be warranted. And I don't know that we have great organic options for that one. Cucumber beetles, if you grow cucurbits, so not just cucumbers, but squashes as well. This is going to be one you want to keep an eye out for. So this can cause a lot of damage. They do damage, but there's other things too. So this is all damage due to cucumber beetles. And what I want to point out in the upper left is that is a very newly emerged seedling from the ground. It still has the seed leaves or cotyledons. It is already damaged and being eaten on by these beetles. So when you have populations there, I've actually heard researchers say they have seen where they will actually go down and attack germinating seeds. So when you have especially high population, these are really, really, really problematic. The bad thing is, especially in the commercial world, they don't even have to kill the plant. But as you see there, that tan area on that watermelon, that was all where that top surface rind was eaten by cucumber beetles. The pumpkin, those tan spots, are feeding damage from cucumber beetles. The bottom right, that cucumber, if you have a cucumber laying on the ground and you roll it over and you see that, that is most likely cucumber beetle damage. They're underneath the cucumber eating away that top surface. And so if you're trying to grow something commercially, all of these mean you have product that are not sellable. They will also directly attack the plant, and that's what the last bottom left picture is showing. You actually see feeding damage on the stem itself, right where it's coming out of the ground. And so can be very, very, very bad pest. We don't have good organic options on this. One time I was working with an organic grower. I'm like, what do you do for cucumber beetles? He goes, you mean besides spray? Because that's about all you got. The only effective, probably organic insecticides that are truly effective on it is pyganic, which is very expensive. Pyganic is the natural form of the synthetic pyrethrins, or those pyrethroids I was talking about. So pyganic is a natural form, and it is eye-wateringly expensive. It is effective, but it also comes with the same caveats that the synthetic forms have of off species. So, if we don't use it appropriately, we can kill pollinators or beneficials with it quite easily because it is the natural form of that synthetic version. What's worse than their feeding damage is the disease they can spread. So I mentioned this earlier, bacterial wilt. It's actually vectored or carried by cucumber beetles. If you ever have plants that wilt down and just never come back, it was most likely bacterial wilt. This is actually a bacteria. And what happens essentially, it plugs up the plumbing of the plant. And so it no longer is able to move water from the roots to the leaves. So this isn't like when you're maybe not watering as much as you should, and you will, see a plant wilt down, but then you water it and later it perks back up. These don't perk back up because the pipes are plugged up. Literally, there's bacterial ooze in there and it doesn't let water flow.
Is that exclusively caused by these beetles?
That is the primary way it's moved. Okay. There might be scenarios where it could be seed-borne. I don't remember exactly, but the biggest issue is the bacteria is carried by the beetles. It's vectored or moved by the beetles. And when they feed, it gets into the plant.
Does that stay in the soil?
This one I don't think stays in the soil as much because it does need that cucumber beetle as a host to move it. So this gets into the plant when those beetles feed.
Does soap? Using soap.
So insecticidal soap. So that's one of the problems we have with some of our control options. And insecticidal soap on the organic side is a great example. Insecticidal soaps would kill cucumber beetles. What it does typically is it strips off their outer layers and they desiccate, they dry out. It works. The problem is you have to see and hit the beetle with the spray. So if I spray this morning and 20 of them land where I spray in the afternoon, Those 20 beetles are perfectly fine because it's not been directly applied to them. And what we would say is there's no residual activity. There's nothing there that controls them after that first application. So there's a lot of organic products that are effective, but they come with that limitation. And so insecticidal soaps are great. In fact, I used insecticidal soap on those aphids that were on the peppers because one, I already had it, and two, they don't move real quick. It's easy to make sure I get them really, really well. And I came back about 3 or 4 days later and did it again to make sure I got everybody. But, that's a different story with cucumber beetles where you're not going to see them all. They do move quickly. They can fly away. And so it is more of a challenge to use some of those contact products. Squash bugs, another one that we see commonly on cucurbits. When they're little gray guys. As they get adults, they turn brown. So there's also a leaf-footed bug, which looks very similar, but their rear legs are wider, looks more leaf-like, and that's how they get the name. You can see the picture there of eggs. That is actually on top of the leaf. They're kind of orangish, football shaped. That's highly unusual to find them on top of a leaf, but this was a field that was just absolutely infested with them. They were everywhere. And so when you get really high numbers, you start seeing things like that where the eggs are just absolutely everywhere. You see them on top of leaves, on the underside of leaves. So we do want to be careful and catch things before them. They're not stink bugs, but they do stink when you squish them. They are related within the families. Yeah, I think it's families. So yeah, they do look similar, but they look different. These are much more elongated than a true stink bug, but marmorated stink bugs look very similar, shorter than these in body length, and then their antennae are black and white striped. And so you see 3 white spots on their antennae. That's how you can quickly tell if it's a brown marmorated stink bug, which would be another common one we can include in this slide deck, but I did not. You can have big numbers like this. The big problem about these are sucking insects. When they are large numbers and they're doing well, you start seeing leaf dieback like this because literally they're taking the sap out of the plant and it's not available for the plant to use. Adults are very hard to control, so this is one of the earlier we find it, the better. Squash vine borer. This is one that it is a moth, although the right picture there, that is the female. Looks waspish, but it is actually a moth. When it gets inside the stem, that caterpillar, so the moth will lay the eggs on the stem. They will chew a hole into the stem, go inside, and then eat from the inside. And so once they're inside that stem, there's not an insecticide we're going to be spraying outside that's going to touch them. So we either have to catch these before they enter into, or one thing we can do is we can actually, when we start seeing a sawdust looking material or frass coming out of that stem, cut it open, find the caterpillar, the larva, pull it out, squish it, and then bury that part of the plant. If you've ever grown cucurbits, wherever they have a node, wherever they have leaves coming off, they will root. And so the hope is that if we allow more roots to happen where the damage is, and if we allow that vine to root down along the length, we'll have basically kind of went around the plumbing problem that was created. Doesn't always work, but sometimes if we catch it when it's small, it will. It is a caterpillar, so we do want to think about what we're applying to control that. BT probably is not the best product for these because they're not eating extensively before they go into the stem. So BT is what we use for caterpillars, depending on the strain of BT. But where they're just kind of getting entry into the stem, I would be afraid they may not eat enough BT. And so I'm not sure how effective it is. But what's good is if we're controlling something like cucumber beetles. And so if we are spraying for that and they are active earlier than squash vine borer, as long as we make a point to spray that stem, especially those lower areas closer to where it's exiting the ground, we can have an effective control that way. Again, this isn't one that always happens. It can happen, and when it does, it really rains on your parade if you only have a couple, and they all succumb to this. Um, but again, if we have this and you see it happening, and either the damage is just too severe, or you try to bury it, it doesn't work, as soon as you can, pull that plant. Because what happens when the caterpillar, the larva, is done feeding, it actually pupates in the soil. So if you can get rid of the plant while it's still inside the plant, you're breaking up that life cycle. And so it's only a positive thing for you. So if you see this happening and you're not having luck remediating it by cutting open that stem, go ahead and get rid of the plant so it doesn't become a nursery. Colorado potato beetles. These are one that are unique in that they have very significant resistance to most of our commonly available, or at least the older chemistry. So things like carbaryl and malathion, which are older chemistries, pretty much don't do much to this insect anymore. They've become resistant to it. And I've never yet found a very good explanation as to why these are so effective at attaining resistance, if that can even be a thing, but they are. And so these are definitely some of our newer chemistries, or ones I would focus on. This will attack all our solanaceous crops. So obviously potato, it's in the name, but also tomatoes and eggplants and peppers, all related, and it can attack all of them. So here's a pop quiz. Is this a Colorado potato beetle? Well, it sure looks like it, except it's not. So the difference is it has a, let me grab my pointer tool here. Here we go. If you look here, and then on the other side, there'd be a corresponding, but you have this copperish band in there. On a true Colorado potato beetle, it's just black and white. There is no copper band on the side of their wing covers. And so it's a small difference. They don't look exactly alike in the head either, but especially if you're just glancing through a garden, you see this on a solanaceous plant, you might say, oh, I got Colorado potato beetles. Double check and make sure that's actually what you're dealing with. So look for a copper stripe or only black and white to define which it is. And obviously, always happy to take a look at pictures or samples if you want to bring those by. All right. Corn earworm or tomato fruit worm. It is a caterpillar of the same moth. Just depends which plant it's on. So if you've ever grown sweet corn, had a worm in your corn ear, you've met this before. If you've ever had worms tunneling directly into your tomatoes, you've met it before. Again, one of the problems with this one is not just the literal damage it caused, but it actually invites decay to happen. So not only is there a wound and feeding damage on that fruit or on the ear of corn, but you actually have entry of decay organisms. So it'll start rotting on the plant even. And so these are ones that we see commonly. There are control options for them. Flea beetles. These are one that are very common. They're called flea beetles because they're really, really well at jumping, and they're small and dark. They don't really look like a flea, so don't let the name, but they do have that habit of jumping really well for their size. They cause that little tiny shot hole damage you see in that potato leaf in the top right. These will sometimes also hit solanaceous weeds. I've seen these in just absolutely devastate weeds in fields before, where they just hammer it. And so anything solanaceous would include some of our weeds like horse nettle. You can find damage of this insect. In the home garden, I would say that if we have very healthy plants, lots of times they can outgrow flea beetle damage as long as it's not too extensive. But there are control options. One, if you're wanting to look at organic options, things like row covers work well for this. But just remember, if it's something like eggplant, you're going to pull it off when it starts flowering, because you got to have pollination to have eggplants. And generally by that time you have a large plant, it's not going to be set back by these guys. These are most harmful on your smallest plants, otherwise stressed, or things like that make them less competitive. Row covers also can work well on the organic side with things like cucumber beetle. But again, once they start flowering, unless We are growing a parthenocarpic variety that doesn't need pollination. We're going to have to pull those covers off and allow pollinator access. So it can be a temporary cover for cucumbers, for instance, or most cucumbers, and then we pull it off. And we hope that our plants are large enough and big enough that maybe some of our other organic control options are harassing enough that they'll go somewhere else or have established themselves somewhere else. Quickly, we know there's beneficial insects out there. Already mentioned this. It's the brachynoid wasp. Ha! Just
There it is.
there's different parasitic wasps. This one happens to be brachynoid. Praying mantis. We actually have 3 kinds in our area: Carolina, European, and Chinese. Not surprising. One of those is native, the Carolina. It's also the smallest. So generally the 2, if you see big praying mantis, that is probably the Chinese, maybe the European.
And what, are they do different things? Or they
So
do
no,
different-
they all function the same. It's just some of them aren't native. So we talk about native and invasive species. You could say that these are invasive species and that they've established themselves in a non-native place. They're a competitor to our Carolina mantid, so they're taking resources away. I'll let you balance it out. I mean, if we're technical, honeybees are not native. So a lot of people want to protect honeybees. And it's like, well, we got a lot of other pollinators that are native, and certainly we don't want to harm honeybees. Don't take that away. But sometimes people are surprised whenever they think, oh yeah, they're not native to the U.S. Here are the egg cases of praying mantis, and so the top left is the Chinese one. That's very conspicuous. If you find those out and about, they're large. They almost look like that great stuff foam. They do appear foamy. They have some firmness to them. I'm not saying you couldn't crush them. The one on the top right is the Carolina. It's the smallest of the 3, and their European is sort of in between the 2. So the ones I have most often found are the Chinese egg cases because they're the largest.
How long have they been here?
Long time.
Decades.
Decades. Yeah, before I was a child, which is getting pretty long now. Whew.
Maybe before I was a child.
I was gonna say, I'm not sure when they were introduced, but they were introduced. I will say this: if you ever find a egg case like this, do not bring it inside. So if you're out and about in winter or fall and you find this, because they can hatch out early, and then you have little mantids running around, and they will eat each other. So they are carnivorous. They will eat their brothers and sisters. No comment about my brothers, but anyway, certainly be careful about taking these into warm temperatures. Lace wings. These are ones that occasionally we see the adults, but great about feeding on aphids. If you see that larva down there, it looks funky. It's got these big pinchers. It itself is not gigantic, but it looks really mean. It is really mean to aphids, so leave it alone. Unique thing about them, they lay a single egg in one spot, and it will have that little stalk attached. So you'll actually occasionally find these where you see this little thing stuck up in the air. It's little tiny, and it's a little tiny filament, but it is pretty neat looking. And they're called lace wings because they have these big, clear wings. Wrong way. Ground beetles. There's a lot of different ground beetles we have in our region. They're something that are more active as night happens, so we don't see them all the time. What we do see is like when we have mulches and things like that in a garden, we're probably more likely to see these. And what's great about it is they do eat insects, but these will also eat slugs and things like that. So, when we talk about killing those off or unintended species, these are some of the ones, for instance, that can be impacted by insecticide use. And now suddenly we have more slugs in the garden, for instance. So anytime we can limit our use to only those must-use cases and make it as narrow of impact as possible, the better off we are. Of course, couldn't talk about beneficial without talking about lady beetles. So the multicolored Asian lady beetle, maybe a pest when it's in our home, or when it's out of doors. Again, it's an invasive species, but they do eat some of our pests. The top right is a spotted lady beetle. It's not round, it's elongated, and it's pink. So it looks very different from what we think of as most lady bugs, where they're roundish, like we see depicted on the others, the classic black and red one there in the center. But again, same basic function and a good guy. We do have those in our area for sure. Saw some in the garden last year at Lincoln Park because we had aphids.
Yeah.
Provide them with a dinner, things show up. Here are some of the life stages you're less familiar with, probably. Upper left are some newly hatched little larvae. They're very small, very dark. You know, you're going to have to take a moment to actually see what they are if you find those in the garden. On the right, we have two different pupa. These will be stuck on leaves like that. So a lot of times we think of pupa being out of the way places or in the soil or things like that. These will be stuck on the leaf. They do look like something because they're these little sort of ovalish, roundish things. But that's actually where the larvae, which are bottom left, turn into those adult beetles.
Wow.
And so you can see the larva there for multi-colored versus the seven spotted, a little bit different in coloration, but basically very similar body shape. And you can see the function. I think I've said this before in a class, but everybody thinks, oh, ladybugs are so cute. When really, to the aphids, they're this big marauding destroyer that eats them all. So I guess it's perspective where you're looking from. Of course, we've got all kinds of pollinators, not just honeybees. Honeybees are great, but like, for instance, squash plants or our cucurbits. Squash was native to Central, South, and North America. So when we talk about, squash planting the three sisters by Native Americans, before Europeans came up, it wasn't the honeybee pollinating it. It was our native pollinators. And we actually have squash bees that pollinate squashes. And so sometimes it's interesting to think about the broad spectrum of pollinators. So I'm going to try to get through the rest in about 20 minutes, and we'll see if I can make it. So spiders, we're familiar with them, all sizes, shapes, colors. They're great. The problem with spiders and even like the mantids are that they're not targeted. So they will eat whatever insect they come along, even a pollinator or something that we want to stay alive. They're just opportunistic. They're predators. And so it's not a bad thing, but it's a reality with them. It's not like those braconid wasps that are very targeted towards those hornworms. These are more generalist predators.
What are those little teeny tiny, they're either orange or red, and you see them crawling around.
Okay.
And you can stick your finger on it and mash it, it will stain.
So
whatever you mashed it on in your finger.
What are they? Are those clover mites? Yeah, I think it's a clover mite. I think they are. But it's the little red.
Your dick and
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a clover mite if I remember correctly.
Spick and span, and it killed them. And I've not seen them since.
So,
I was out there cleaning my railing,
and so,
and I thought I'm just going to squirt them.
So, we would never advocate off-label use of a product, but certainly, basically, sometimes products are used just because they're available. But yeah, there's actually a lot of things that can kill insects. The problem is when we talk about plants, this is why I never recommend you go look for a recipe for insecticidal soap, is because you can actually damage plants utilizing soaps as we know them, like in the house, because true insecticidal soaps are potassium salty fatty acids, and the soap we wash our hands with, for instance, are sodium. So it's not the same chemical. So we hear insecticidal soap, we say, oh, I got soap. I'll look online and mix up a recipe. That is not at all the same product. You can cause damage. I knew some researchers at a university that they were using it to drive turf pest out of the soil, make up soapy solution. They'll crawl up out of the soil because it's bothersome to them. They were doing that, and they came back the next year and they did it again, and suddenly they were killing all the grass. They're like, uh-oh, the formulation had changed in that soap product. Didn't have to tell you on the label that they changed it because it's not a pesticide product. But they went from a product that they were able to do it without any negative effects to they were killing plants. And so I always encourage people not to make your own insecticidal soap.
Killing the weed.
Maybe. So with diseases, we're going to switch gears to diseases. There's a few things we can generally do always, and it means we'll have a better outcome. Limit leaf wetness, whether it's not irrigating and wetting the plant, but actually wetting the soil instead. increasing air circulation. This can be everything from how we orient the rows to a primary wind direction. Another thing to remember, disease control agents, our pesticides there for disease control, are not curative in nature. They're protective. They don't cure something once it's already infected. We have to make sure we have identity correct with these, because the products that control bacteria typically aren't great at controlling fungus. So if you're spraying a fungicide on a bacteria, it's probably going to like the extra moisture. So we've got to make sure we know what we're dealing with. And the other thing to understand, and this is probably just me being picky, very often people call me and say, my whatever tree got the blight. There's a few diseases that we do refer to as blight, late blight and early blight. Not every leaf disease is the blight. So just be aware of that. That's probably me being too picky. But so 2 common diseases in our garden with cucurbits. Seems like cucurbits have a lot of problems, but I think we get a lot of good out of them. So hopefully they're worth it. Downy and powdery mildews. Downy on the left, powdery on the right. Powdery, it looks like someone put white powder on the leaf. Downy, it starts with kind of the yellowing leaf spots, and then it progresses to where it's pretty radical like that. And ultimately, it'll kill a plant pretty quickly within a week or so. If you're familiar with tobacco at all, remember blue mold of tobacco. Downy mildew is a blue mold, or blue mold is downy mildew. It's the same family of pests. So it comes into our environment the same way blue mold did on tobacco, and spread by the wind. So we find powdery mildew across many, many species in the garden. If you've ever grown zinnias, you've probably seen powdery mildew. It's actually different organisms depending on the species of plant. Some of them are more broadly on plants, some of them are very narrow, but same functional organism basically in that how it behaves and the damage it causes. So anytime we can have good airflow, things dry out faster, it's better. Powdery mildew, we got enough humidity, we're probably going to see it often anyway. Sometimes we can plant early and avoid some of the humidity. There are resistant varieties for both of these. Downy mildew is harder to find, but there are some very good home options. There's a few suppliers that are selling to homeowners for some of the downy resistant cucumbers. Last year I bought, I think it's DMR 401. That's just the number that was assigned to it when it was being researched, from actually Southern Exposure Seeds, which is primarily a homeowner supply source. Although farmers can use them too, certainly. But those did great for me, and they really did well. Downy is more difficult to control, but downy is fairly regular when it shows up in our area. And so at a university, ourselves and other universities actually have sentinel plots out where they plant things out, purposely don't spray them so they can see when downy shows up. Because you can spray for downy, but homeowners don't have super great slam dunk products for it. Commercial growers have better products. And so I like using the downy mildew resistant lines when I can find them, and they are getting more prevalent on the market, but you're not going to find them in the seed rack at Walmart or Lowe's, unfortunately, yet. Early blight. So early blight on tomatoes. We can find this on other solanaceous crops too. You get those spots with the concentric ring, sometimes bullseye described. Can be very, very damaging when we're not having any sort of spray program. There's not really great resistance out there for these. This picture is actually pulled out of managing early blight of tomatoes in Tennessee. The top is where you have a spray program in place. The bottom is where you have no spray program. And so basically that's a very dramatic difference. And so you do, as homeowners, have some products available to you that can work well. Again, I'll refer you back to that publication on controlling diseases for what particular products. These start on the lower leaves. So generally when people talk about blight in tomatoes, this is what they're talking about. It's coming from the soil. So once we have it in a garden, probably have it there with fairly for a long time, let's say. There might be a way to rotate away from it, but it's going to be a very large number of years for that to be effective. But there are some things we can do. Look for resistant varieties. There are a few, especially some of those came out of the breeding programs of North Carolina. So actually, their tomato researcher, Randy Gardner, he did a lot of work at the Mountain Research Station, which is kind of like the other side of the mountains of us. So things that work that well there generally work well here, very well. So some of his varieties out there do very great in our area because of that. Again, the same basic practices we'll reiterate almost every disease. Limit leaf wetness. So that could be, making sure we have our plants utilizing, whether it's staking or caging to get them up so they're not laying on top of each other. Pruning for the purposes of enhancing airflow and making sure we don't have weeds crowding in on our plants, holding in moisture either. Mulch prevents the soil splash because this is coming from our soil. And we can, when we start seeing infection on those lower leaves, we can get rid of those leaves, trash them, burn them, because it will go from leaf to leaf, walking up the plant essentially. We do have some good fungicide products on the organic side, things like copper and sulfur. Actinovate might have some activity. Actinovate is a product that kind of works to enhance the resistant system of the plant more or less, so it can have some good efficacy. I actually recycled this slide from another talk. That's why it has a focus on organic on it. Late blight. This is not one that is as common, but it pops up every now and again. Now, a number of years ago, there was a big outbreak in Kentucky, and we know at least part of the problem was it was being brought in on tomato plants that were being brought into the region. That may not always be the case, but it likes colder, wet conditions. So lots of times our springs are hot, so we don't see this one as often. But this is one that can be devastating to solanaceous crops. This is the one that caused the Irish potato famine. So it can be very damaging when it happens. But again, generally cooler, wetter years, we don't have a ton of summers that are cool and wet if we describe them. So not as common. And it will come in on plant material. There are resistant varieties. Again, those good practices we've already talked about. And on the organic side, copper is probably our best option. And there are non-organic options as well that do work well for us, but not any one fungicide controls every fungicide. And so certainly when we have bacterial problems, fungicides are of little use to us because we're dealing with a bacteria, not a fungus. So when we have things like this, and there's a few other diseases of tomatoes I didn't throw in here. We have like bacterial speck, bacterial spot. Those are bacterias, obviously. It can sort of look similar to septoria, but generally you don't have that big yellow halo around it. So pretty distinctive on septoria. That's why when people send me pictures, if you send me pictures that look like this, I can probably make a really good guess as to what it is if I can see the details on those spots. That helps clue in. This will also hit celery of all things, but definitely all our other nightshades or solanaceous crops. Doesn't kill the plant, but you're removing leaves. Leaves are the powerhouse of the plant, so you're reducing your yields. And as those leaves drop, you will literally burn your tomatoes. They get sun scald. So we got to be careful with this one. Again, resistant varieties were available. We can remove lower leaves as they're being infected, and we can use mulch again because this is soil-borne. So all those are good. Copper, again, is probably a good option. Potassium bicarbonate, I would say, is a maybe. It's not as strong. We have wilts that will happen in tomatoes sometimes. These are two that I think we can fairly easily find resistant varieties to these. So if you've ever looked in a catalog or on a seed packet and seen things like V or F after a tomato name, they were referencing Fusarium and Verticillium wilts. So it was saying this is resistant. Again, resistance is not immunity, but if we know this has been a problem before, we can actually cut open stems and see discoloration like you see on the left. Lots of times these are more associated with wet field conditions. So it is something to be aware of. These are not host specific, meaning these can attack a lot of different things in the garden. These stay in the soil for years once established. So once we have these problems there, if we're going to keep planting, then we have to choose resistant varieties, and we do have some options. We can use mulch to prevent leaf infections, but we still have the roots attacked because it's in our soils. There is some research looking at utilizing solarizing. So you take clear plastic or black, place it over a soil that's wet, and then allow the summer temperatures to bake your soil more or less and hopefully kill the pathogen. I'd have to go back and revisit how effective the current research says that is, but that's one strategy if you have this problem, because again, it's going to be in our soils for years once it is established. This was one that I thought would be good because it affects more than just potatoes like we see here, but root crops. So when we have things, potatoes, carrots, onions, soft rots, one of the problems is this takes advantage whenever we have cold, wet springs. This can be on the what we plant in the soil. So our seed potatoes or onion bulbs or sets, we can actually bring this in. This is one where we want to rotate away from root crops if we have it pop up. I want to make a point to plant other things in that area. Organic matter, if we have soils that are a little heavier, a little wetter, adding organic matter can improve the drainage. The other thing we can do if we think this is a problem for us is pull those crops out of the ground as quick as we can once they reach maturity. And I realize this strategy for some of these is to leave them in the garden and dig as needed. But if this is actually a problem, if we can get them out and in the dry, we have better results. So just think about that. So we mentioned this earlier, but again, bacterial wilt, it's transmitted by those cucumber beetles. We can use row covers on young plants. What we can also do, because especially if we know we're not going to use conventional insecticides, and so we don't have great strategies, you can just plan on planting more than one planting of cucumbers, because basically we can have the death before the full production is over. So this can terminate a crop early, essentially. And so by having a second planting going in, you can extend your season that way, even if one cropping gets attacked. That's no guarantee that it won't suffer the same fate, but hopefully that will at least spread out the harvest some for you. On the organic side, there are some people that think Surround, which is actually a kaolin clay spray. It's basically a white powdery stuff that you spray onto your plants. Some people think that it deters the beetles. They don't like it. It doesn't hurt your plant at all. It actually can increase photosynthesis because it can lower leaf temperature. It's been looked at in nursery crops for that very characteristic. But it's probably of marginal utility. Really, if you've got a big problem, Surround is not going to fix it. Then we've got some viruses that pop up. Viruses are typically denoted by odd appearances. So in some cases, that's deformities. And in the cucumber mosaic virus, it's coloration. So you get this mottling pattern, not just on leaves, but also on fruit. It can actually hit a number of different plants. This one is transmitted or vectored by aphids. We can also bring it in on infected plants. Generally, this is where if we can keep insects from moving into the garden from around it, so utilizing weed control to not be a harborage for these insects, the aphids that transmit it, roguing or destroying. When I say rogue, that means removing, ripping out any infected plants we find, because if aphids are feeding on those affected plants, they will pass it on to the next plant they go to. And some aphids do have wings and fly. So we do want to be careful of that. And again, this is one that we can fairly readily find disease-resistant varieties. So if you've seen it, I like planting a diverse variety of different things. So when it comes to cucumbers, I'd like to try to find the most resistant varieties. And not everything is resistant to everything. So you
Is it
do,
English cucumber?
I think it would depend on the variety. So, Bristol is not a bad one for our area. And I think they've actually replaced that one with another one, but the name isn't coming to mind. But for a long time, Bristol was a good long slicer that worked well in our area. Anthracnose can happen on a lot of different plants. Here you see a pepper and a watermelon, obviously not related to each other, but it will hit, again, solanaceous or nightshades, cucurbits, beans, watermelons. This is one where we like using mulch. It prevents soil splash. We want to keep things as dry as possible. So either use drip irrigation or run overhead early in the morning. So as the day heats up, it dries out faster. We don't want to water at the end of the day and make things wet overnight. If we start seeing this come in, especially when it's on fruit or even it's the whole plant, we probably want to remove those because, again, this can be a source of the disease for the rest of the planting. And on the organic side, copper is probably our best option. So that was a mouthful tonight, and I realize that. Normally I split these two apart, but I was trying to get them both in the same top. So I know it was a fire hose this evening. I apologize for that. Let me point you again to the resources, same links you've seen before, but I do want to highlight, obviously, those three I mentioned earlier. Some other resources I really like on this topic, and they're on the resource list. It's from University of Kentucky Integrated, or IPM, Integrated Pest Management Scouting Guides. These are actually written for commercial operations, but they have some great pictures in them. What I also like about them is it has not just insect and disease problems. You will see things like cold weather injury or certain nutritional deficiencies that can look like a disease. And so you'll actually see something that may make you say, what is this? And so it's not everything is it. Sometimes we refer to things like nutritional deficiencies or cold damage as abiotic disorders or diseases, if you want to, because it's not actually caused by a biological specimen. And so I like that because it has that kind of information included in it, and the pictures are still very good.